Welcome to Inspiring Heartfelt Conversations. My name is Barbara Morningstar. This series is presented by In Autumn's Cocoon, which offers education on a range of end-of-life topics in the form of talks, workshops, and writings. For more information, you can go to inautumnscocoon.com. Today, my guest is Thomas Attig. He's the author, speaker, and applied philosopher. Thomas has written many books, including The Heart of Grief, Death and the Search for Lasting Love, and How We Grieve, Relearning the World. He is also the author of numerous articles and reviews on grief and loss, care of the dying, death education, and the nature of applied philosophy. He is a well-known and deeply respected speaker, having presented talks and workshops at conferences around the world. Welcome, Thomas.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Oh, such a privilege to have you here today, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation. So what we're going to focus on is grief and relearning the world. So I want to start because your background is in philosophy, which is a little bit of a different entrance into the conversation on grief and bereavement. So how did your interest in philosophy then bridge to your work in grief and end-of-life care?
I was interested in philosophy because it seemed like something that would be teachable, and I wanted to be a teacher more than anything else. I thought I was going to teach math until I figured out that I didn't want to teach trigonometry every year to people who didn't want to learn it. And the same formulas and the same problems over and over. And in the humanities, you can have changing conversations over the years. So that really interested me. And as I studied it a bit, I noticed that they were interested in something I didn't quite have words for, but the words are pretty clear. I was interested in working in a field where if your heart is in it, you can do what the meaning of the term is all about. You can seek wisdom. And what I wanted all of my life, I guess, was wisdom about how to live well, a life with integrity and meaning, given how little we know and given that it's a finite thing rather than going on forever. So I was studying philosophy. I got an undergraduate degree at Northwestern, and then I was doing my PhD work. And my father died, and it was an expected death, and he had declined for about 5 years from a series of strokes. So it was timely. I can't say that I was overwrought or caught up in a lot of pain and anguish, but I was headed back after the funeral to the philosophy department where I was doing my graduate work and thinking, who can I approach just to have a conversation like this about, what was it like for just wondering together? What was it like for my father to perhaps sense that he was breathing some of his last breaths? What were his 70 years or 73 years like for him? What did those years mean to him? And what did my 23 years with him mean to me? And as I thought about my professors, I thought, well, he's a little stiff. No, his subject matter is pretty far from this. I'm not sure that I would be comfortable talking to him about this. And I kind of vowed to myself as I was driving back to St. Louis, I'm going to be a teacher of philosophy, and I want to be one that people would approach and would be happy to approach to talk about the meaning of life, the choices that we can make, and so on. So I wound up teaching philosophy, and the Bowling Green State University, where I had my first full-time job, was just opening up a new college of health and human services that included programs in nursing, social work, gerontology, child and family services, and the like. And some of my colleagues were teaching applied philosophy courses like medical ethics and business ethics and ethics in the environment. And I thought, for this new college, there's probably room for a course on ethical issues in death and dying, like suicide, abortion, capital punishment, whatever, because we'd been talking about them in my ethics classes. And by the time I got approval to teach the course and thought about what the students in that college were going to need, I realized they're not going to necessarily have ethical issues at the front of their agenda. They're going to worry about, can I actually go into a room with someone who's dying? And how well am I going to do there? Can I deal with or help a family that's grieving after someone's died? And they're really going to be concerned about those things. And they're going to be reminded of their own mortality. So I better teach a course that speaks to that. And I didn't recognize too much in philosophy at the time anyway that was going to help me. And I sort of thought I was leaving philosophy behind and becoming a kind of interdisciplinary one-man band as I read psychology and history and sociology and English literature and poetry and looked at films and all kinds of things. And in my early years of teaching, and then I continued it through all of them, I had personal exercises I asked my students to do. And one of them was to write about their 3 most important losses in their lives. And they may have been losses through death, but if they didn't have 3 of those, maybe their family broke up in some way, or maybe a best friend moved away, or maybe their parents became unemployed and they had to change where they were living. Anyway, I read thousands of these things over a period of years, and I discovered that they were not talking about going through stages or coming down with an illness and treatable symptoms. They were talking about, how can I go in that room again, given what happened there? Or what are we going to do with the stuff in the closet? Or, gosh, I wish I'd had a conversation with Mom about this or with Dad about that. Why did he have to die so ugly? What led to that suicide? And so on. You know, I had a student write about how his father was in the living room and had a gun in his hand, and he had to wrestle the gun out of his father's hand because he was going to kill himself. Well, there are issues then in the aftermath of the kinds of experiences that they were writing about that just weren't captured in the literature about grief and loss. No one went through 5 stages. No one talked about even 2 of the 5. And I thought, maybe I could, what is it they're actually doing? Well, they're talking about returning to a world that's changed because this person has died. And they're trying to figure out how to live in that world. I can't go on setting a table for this man to show up and dine with me because he's not coming back. Right. I have to learn some things that she knew how to do that no one's ready to do. And if I don't learn them, I'm not going to live very well. And things like that, right. Which are pretty far from 5-stage models. So then I started writing about the idea of grieving as relearning how to live in the world. And as I wrote more and more, I discovered that my training in philosophy, 1, was helping me to see the limits of the concepts that are out there in these other disciplines. And 2, the particular kind of philosophy I was trained in taught me to analyze the general contours and family resemblances among different significant human experiences. And philosophers hadn't written a whole lot about grief, but it's possible as a philosopher to analyze that experience in detail. Mm-hmm. And existentialism is a philosophy that sort of pushes you in the direction of wondering about the meaning of a life that's finite and limited and not all mapped out for you, and so on. And I was doing philosophy all along as I was listening to my students and learning from them about the richness of grief. How's that for a nice short answer?
Well, it actually leads beautifully. I pulled a quote from How We Grieve, which reflects so profoundly on what you've just sort of introduced us to, and I'm going to read it. And so you say, each of us is the subject of an ongoing experience of the world with a unique contour and integrity worthy of respect. Loss of another through death affects, often profoundly, the entire fabric of our experiencing and acting in the world. Bereavement challenges us to relearn virtually all components of our worlds as we experience them.
That's me.
That's a rich quote, and when you sit in the truth of that, it is true. I mean, here's this person in the center of it, and the way you enter into it, you just honor so beautifully. When that person's removed, it ripples out in so many different ways, but you show the interaction beforehand. So when you say relearning the world, what do you mean by that? Can you help the audience understand what you mean by that? You have kind of three reflections
I think
on that.
that from the beginning of our lives, we're learning how to live. Not just how to think, not just how to talk. We're learning how to engage with our physical surroundings, and we're manipulating and playing with and trying to figure out how this works and that works. And we're going out in nature and we're finding out about flowers and trees and how they're connected with one another and so on. We orient ourselves in our physical surroundings. And there are these people who are paying attention to us, and we're learning how to live with mom and learning how to live with dad and learning how to live with the people into whose arms they put us when we're very small, or in whose presence we're left when they have to go to work or do other things in their lives. So we're learning how to engage with our social surroundings and get along with other people and learn from other people and do things together with other people. And at some point we start growing an understanding of I'm a self, I'm a person in my own right. And we learn things about what makes us tick, what we want and what we want to avoid, and what we are fascinated by and what we're kind of put off by, and so on. And gradually we get to a point where we have a sense of we're part of something that's really very much larger than we are. And we learn how to have a sense of, I hope in most cases, being at home in the greater scheme of things. And in some cases, we come to have experiences that suggest that there's something more that we don't necessarily see and hear and touch that has brought us where we are and equipped us with what it takes to do this, learning how to live. So we do it, and we do what grieving people do from the very beginning of our lives. And I've asked audiences, raise your hand if you think that you have finished learning how to live. And no one ever raises their hand. Right? Well, suppose something happens in your life. Your mother dies, or your lover dies, or your child dies, or anybody that you really care about dies, and your world is now different. Everything that requires their physical presence is impossible now. Everything that requires that they be physically present in your life, you can't do anymore. But within you, you have dispositions to continue and habits to continue and desires that you still want to fulfill by going to talk with mom or going to spend time with grandma or taking a walk with your best friend. And that's not possible anymore. So you have to relearn how to be and act and feel in new ways. You don't change everything, but you blend new ways of engaging with a world where this person's no longer physically present. So there's going to be inevitable change, but a lot of what's familiar living with other people and living in your physical environment and so on, a lot remains the same. So it seems to me when you're relearning how to live in the world, you're learning to trust again things that you can return to that still work in how you live. And you're inevitably stretching into something new. Right. And it seems to me that just like the process of learning how to live is a lifelong thing, so too is grieving. Mm-hmm. Because your loved one has touched the world and left it different for having been here in so many places and in so many ways that it can be 10 or 15 years before you run across this thing that was touched by them and changed by them. And now they're not here and it feels different to be in that exact same place. And 15 years later, well, for example, I had a couple, their 3-year-old daughter died suddenly. She fell off a swing in the backyard. She didn't break her skull or anything, but she revved up an illness that they didn't know she had. And over the weekend, she died. It was a brain condition. And they had a young son who was 2 years older than their daughter. So the 3-year-old daughter has died and the 5-year-old son remains. 5 years later, these people are telling me about how they decided to go to the sand dunes in Michigan. And they just wanted to do that, and they wanted to give their son that experience and so on. So they went and they climbed the sand dunes, and they get to the top. And the dad was carrying the little guy for a while, and he climbed for a little while, and so on. They get to the top, and the woman, Helen, starts crying. And Roger, her husband, says, "Did you hurt yourself?" No. I just realized something. We always wanted to bring Mary here, and I just now realized that. And I'm missing her, so I'm crying. Well, do you want to go? Do you want to get in the car? This is the male thing. You want to, what can we do? All right. He's that kind of guy anyway. She says, no, just hold me, you idiot. And let me cry myself out. And once I've finished crying, then we'll decide what to do. Okay. So a few minutes and he's holding her and the little guy's playing by himself and doing just fine. And she stops crying and she said, "You know what? I've decided we always wanted to bring Mary here. And I feel like I'm here as like her representative. Mm-hmm. Let's stay, let's enjoy it, and let's look at it, and let's kind of see it through Mary's eyes as well as our own. And I think we can have a good experience here." Now, that woman relearned how to live on sand dunes 5 years after their daughter had died. Okay, it's like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just, that was the thing in how we grieve. You take a number of different, like the story you just shared, and you take a number of different scenarios from the death of a parent to a child to a spouse, a sibling, sudden deaths and anticipated deaths. But what you do, which is so intimate, which touched me deeply in the read, because, I'm also reviewing my life and I'm thinking of all the losses in my life. And now I'm older. I see the ripple of that. But you start by showing, you call it the web of life, the web and the weave of each individual and how they're interconnected and how they're responding to each other. And the individual in the center who eventually becomes ill, or they're adapting to that. And then the time of death, whether it's sudden and sort of the dynamic around that and how everyone's engaged. And then later, this empty space in this web. And yet, as you said, there's this weave of engagement. And you, Thomas, you do it so beautiful. Like you invited me into the richness of that connectivity or web in a way that really moved me profoundly because, like you said, there's stages and tasks but it's not that simple. There's a weave here, there's a weave here. And then when that person leaves, just on the sand dune, there's still a weave. It just, the rhythm's going to change, but there's still this web and connectedness that now is being redefined. I mean, it was beautiful.
There are loose ends.
Right.
And some can be reconnected to the person who's died, and some can't because that physical presence isn't there. But you're going to have, if you think of the whole web, a person is like a wedge of the web. There are all kinds of threads connecting you to mom, or to dad, or to your lover, or to your best friend. And when they die, that grounding that relationship provides is removed because those threads aren't connecting. A lot of them, the ones that require physical presence anyway, aren't connecting anymore. And if you were to hit a web in the corner of a room, a big enough one, think what happens to the web. There's a big effect where you hit it, but there's ripple effects throughout the rest of you, through the rest of your web. And if your child dies, it's going to change your relationship with your spouse. Mm-hmm. It's going to change your relationship with that child's siblings. It's going to change your relationship with teachers and others at school. It's going to change your relationship with your friends, some of whom will come through for you and be good supports and understand you, and some of whom will disappoint you, many times to such an extent that people lose friends. Mm-hmm. If you just think about it, so you're the wage earner for the family and so on, and then this happens. Is this going to affect how you connect with your fellow workers, some of whom appreciate that you need some slack, and others of whom insist that no big deal. The expectations are the same. We'll see you on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. Mm-hmm. Throughout the web, there are changes in relationships and new tensions, and some things might break off altogether. But all of this is in a context where you have a web of connections with other people and things and places and so on, unlike anybody else. Mm-hmm. And the person sitting next to you has a corresponding but different web of their own. And this one, so we're in this kind of network, a web of webs, and the whole world and the whole universe. Everything is connected to everything. Absolutely everything is connected to everything, including our 13 billion year connection to that initial event where at least the universe is making an imprint that we can track. But who knows what else there is. But everything that we know exists. We are children of the sun. Everything that is on Earth came from the sun. Everything. All of the minerals and the rocks and the soils and the waters and so on are products of the sun having exploded and sent things out into space, and then they come together and form a planet. We are sun children in a very profound way. There's a physicist, I can't remember his name now, he's on TV, he does regular programming. And he was asked, what's the most astonishing finding in astronomy? He said, when I think about it and think about it really hard, it's that we are made of stardust.
That's kind of magical. It's kind of magical. Well, there's a mystery to it. And, one of the things you said, because you just talked about tasks and stages, but you talk about grief being more active and choosing to grieve actively. We choose life. But you also said something referring to the stages that they suggest that we can somehow finish coping with mystery.
Yeah, which seems pretty silly to me. You want me to talk about stages for a minute?
Sure.
Okay. I heard a fellow who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. His name is David Kessler. And after she died, within a few years, he wrote a book saying that she recognized that her initial talk about 5 stages was 5 stages that people who are dying go through as they're struggling to acknowledge what's really happening to them. But people had interpreted her as offering a theory of grieving. And Kessler's view was, in working with her, I saw her as finally coming around to the idea that it also applies to grieving. And then he proceeded to talk about the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I sat there listening, and it was a slow delivery of something that's so familiar that I had a chance to kind of think about what was coming at me. And she was a traditional psychoanalyst in her training, and they tend to focus on egos, which is a kind of little part of who we are that lives on the surface of life and enables us to navigate on that surface, make reasonable decisions, self-interested decisions, take care of ourselves, control what we're able to control, and with that control, accomplish a great deal. And as egos do that sort of thing, they tend to forget the in-depth part of what a human being is and the soul and spirit that's working within them, but not nearly as visibly. Anyway, I'm listening to this thing and I'm thinking of, okay, psychologists talk about fight and flight defenses. You come up against something that you perceive as threatening, and you either decide you're going to stand up to it, you're going to fight it, you're going to try to get control of it, or you realize that it's just too big, and you're going to retreat and come back to fight a smaller fight another day, rather than being overwhelmed by this thing that's too big. And I listened to the description of these 5 stages, and I heard them entirely in terms of the ego defenses. Mm-hmm. Denial. Pretend that a reality you can't do anything about isn't real. That doesn't work. Anger. I mean, how many of you have engaged with children who think that if their anger can be accelerated or lifted to white heat and so on, they can get control of just about anything? Anger can be, in part, in the experiences of many people, an attempt to control the uncontrollable. And in the case of a dying or a death that's already taken place, you can't control that. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to do you a lot of good to resort to that defense. Bargaining, an attempt to negotiate, bargain about what's non-negotiable. Boy, these ego defenses aren't working here. I can't run away in denial, and the stuff of standing toe-to-toe with it, I can't get control, and I can't make it go away or change it. In any way. I feel like crap. Depression. I'm really disappointed that this stuff doesn't work. And then acceptance. Oh my God, this is real. It's really happening for the dying. It's really happened for the bereaved. Okay. And to then say that's the end of grief, as opposed to this is the reality I have to learn to live with. And my ego isn't helping me with that. It must be something else that's going to help me deal with this loss that's taken place. And you've read my stuff. I think there is a will to live that's within us that is shaken, but not broken. And it's comprised of 2 components, a kind of what I call soul, which is this drive to make ourselves at home, to care and to love and connect and find meaning and connection, especially with loved ones. And there is something I call spirit, which is a drive to overcome suffering, a drive to make things better, a drive to grow and learn and pursue purposes and seek meaning and so on. And the 5 stages that Kubler-Ross writes about, and Kessler says that's pretty much the end of it on grief, don't speak to what these deeper things within us are capable of doing and that need doing. Egos are not built for care and love. They just aren't.
Yeah, and I just want to say I did hear Elizabeth Kubler-Ross speak in person. I think it was 93. One of the hospices brought her up, and she actually talked about her frustration about everyone taking her reflections in a literal and linear way, and she'd never meant that. And I know, David, I've heard Kubler-Ross's son actually speak to that, saying that, there were times she said, I wish I'd never laid those out. Because it was a foundation. And David Kessler's recently written a book on finding meaning too, to go deeper with it. So
he's catching up with a field that went way ahead of them for a long period of time.
Yeah. So I'm honoring deeply. Bless her heart. She was trying hard in the beginning, right?
I think what she deserves credit for, and it is monumental. It's not trivial. She got whole cultures talking about something that they had declined to talk about for centuries. And the conversation has gone past sort of where she initially kind of sorted things out. It is true that people do have ego defenses that they do try to deploy in lots of life circumstances. It just happens that in some, like dealing with death or bereavement, they're not very good. And her own arguments suggest that you move away from denial, bargaining, or anger, not necessarily in any particular order, because none of them really are effective. And depression is pretty rotten when the standard stuff you do all day long with your ego in charge, living on the surface of life, which is where we are most of the time, isn't working. That's depressing. Where do I go? What do I do? And you do get to this point of this dying is really happening.
Yes.
This death has really happened.
Yes.
And that's a much better place to be. Right. But that's the beginning. It's not the whole of the story. It's the beginning of the story.
Well, so then, and you say that grieving is actually active, and in choosing to grieve actively, we choose life.
I do say that. I've been in these international organizations, and there was a guy named Randolph Grossman. I'm not mentioning his name because you have to go out and read his stuff. He's from Germany, and we were having a casual conversation. He said, I just marvel at, there's a basic distinction in psychology. In a lot of psychology, there's a basic distinction between reaction, which is like a reflex. It's like something that comes over you that you don't control, you don't bring it about, you don't actively engage to sort of bring anger to your life. Anger comes in, sorrow comes in, tears come over you, screaming comes out of you when you realize what's happened. That's reaction. It's passive. It happens to us, just like loss happens to us. Grief reaction happens to us, and it's a complex of emotions, and they differ from person to person. There are also physical reactions. There are social reactions as people are repelled by us or drawn to us or whatever, or we're drawn to them. There are probably even soulful and spiritual reactions, changes that come over us, impacts that come our way. And he said, in contrast to reactions, there are responses. And responses are what you do with what happens to you. And you have a choice about what you do. All right. And my early writings suggested that in an awful lot of what I read, people were talking about reactions. That dominated the literature for years, and people were talking about I'm overcome by all of these intense emotions. I feel stuck, I feel overwhelmed, I feel helpless. And people would talk about, well, find somebody who will sit with you while you're feeling helpless. But not a whole lot of suggestion about what you can do. And in introducing this idea of grieving as relearning the world, I was echoing, but elaborating in more detail on a number of writers who had talked about tasks and the like. Bill Warden was really good at identifying 5 tasks. I don't think they're tasks. Tasks are like little things you can put a list on the refrigerator and you finish it and you check it off and you're done with a task. It's a small bit of work that you can finish. I think emotionally adjusting to the death of a loved one is a lifelong project. Socially adapting how you're going to live as a family, given that mom has died, that's not a task. That's a lifelong project.
Just bridging to that in a lot of your writings, like when you talk about relearning the world, instead of sort of focused on the task or the stages, you talk about relearning the world, relearning ourselves, and relearning our relationship with the deceased. Can you speak to that? That's more active in a sense, right?
That whole process? Well, Grossman talked about the contrast between reactions and responses. And if I'm claiming that grieving response can be characterized as relearning the world, well, that's active engagement with everything you've ever engaged with. So you return to your physical surroundings, your social surroundings, to living within your own skin and thinking about what you want to do and what you value and what matters most to you. And you return to finding your place at home in the great scheme of things, and perhaps in relationship to a deity, if you think in those terms. And you return to still holding in your heart the person who's died. Now, I can talk about holding in one's heart in a number of ways, but it's a combination of returning to the familiar, and in some cases, finding that old and familiar meanings are still to be found there. And in some cases, maybe letting go of what's really not working for you, given that you can't presently enjoy it with the person who's died. And stretching into the new. It's a combination of doing what a soul does, rehabituating you, making yourself at home again in the familiar, or what becomes familiar as you fold in new elements, and inevitably stretching into the new, doing different things in your daily routine, reshaping your life pattern of how you spend your time through the week, through the month, through the years. What am I talking about? Relearning
the world.
Oh, yeah.
Yourself and with the other, the deceased.
And you stretch into new and unexpected chapters in your life story. You saw your future in a pretty steady framework, and then that included your loved one being there with you. And now a major character in the story you thought you were going to be living is missing. So you're going to inevitably be living out a different life story. And it can be pretty clearly in sequence with the story that went before, or there might be some real major breaks. I mean, imagine that your whole family is killed in an air crash, or you're in a car crash and you're the only survivor. People have experiences like that. or a whole community is affected by 20 kids in the local grade school where a couple of your kids attended are killed in one of these mass murders.
Right.
There's a lot that changes, and sometimes the changes are so big and it's hard to return to anything that's familiar because a lot of the familiar has really been destroyed. All right. That it can be overwhelming, and people really have a hard time going back to a world that's been devastated. It's hard for me to imagine, for example, but I mean, good things can be written and are being written about the experiences of refugees who are refugees from hell on earth. Because if you stay, your children will be slaughtered in front of you. And you put them on a boat and hope that they get across. That kind of experience is unimaginable to you and me. I really think it is.
Even my interview with Dr. Val Fermani talks about meeting Viktor Frankl, who was in the concentration camps, and I can't even begin to wrap my heart, my head, or my being around what that and yet how he emerged from that is really quite profound. And not everyone did, obviously. They didn't survive, but it's interesting what came out of that for him and how he influenced the world based on that impact, right?
But I do think that the framework of thinking about things in terms of relearning the world captures the scale of it. Captures the depth of it. And I think that when I started doing this and I would interact with people who were working in various professions and they were invoking 5 stages and so on, part of what I sensed in some people was a desire to have a sense of control in contexts where they don't feel like they're very much in control at all. Going into a room with a bereaved husband whose wife has just died, or a bereaved mother whose child has just died, and so on. Well, I'll look for those stages. I've got a framework here. If I see anger, I know what I can do. If I see bargaining, I know what I can do. And I don't think there's anything that can give us that kind of comfort when you go in and meet people in the depths of heartache that they're experiencing. I wrote a little thing a couple of years ago. I was invited to talk, and the clock was running down, and I was going to have my 15 minutes, and I really hadn't settled on what I wanted to talk about. And I started writing notes on the back of an envelope. And by the time I had the talk to give, I talked about a dozen good things about grieving. It's not only about the bad stuff that happens to you, there's sadness and sorrow that comes over you. It's about engaging with it. It's about active engagement, and you have choices. And that matters a lot. And it's not about seeking closure. I really think that there are some things you can get closure on, like the answer of a question, can we find the body? And you do, and that's an answer. It's been found. Things like that. Maybe in a court trial, you can get a satisfactory verdict where the person is found to actually be guilty. And now you've got an answer to that question, who's responsible? Things like that. But we don't get closure on missing the person who's died. You'll do that the rest of your life. Not in concentration like at the beginning, and not all the time, but at any moment, you may be triggered into missing again, and some sadness and tears and so on. And you don't get closure on loving the person who's died. You will love them until you die. Exactly. And if missing and loving and separation are core parts of grieving, my view is that there's no such thing as closure in grieving.
Well, and I know Dr. Alan Wolfeld, I've been moved by his companioning philosophy, but one of the words he uses is it's to integrate the loss.
Yeah.
You integrate it in because it's a part of the tapestry of your life, and it's an ongoing journey, right? And I've always loved that way of looking at it, which you're also highlighting, because you can't have closure on someone who gave birth to you.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have closure on, my husband lost a child, in his first marriage. And oh my goodness, that child had an impact for the rest of his life and on the sibling. When my husband died, I'd never experienced the depth of that intimate. He died in my arms. I remember being at home a few days later going, what am I supposed to do with this? My heart has just been opened in a way I have never experienced to this depth before. And now you're gone. And so what am I supposed to do with it? And I remember standing there going, like feeling my chest so wide, like never before, but then in grief at the same time. And I'm thinking, like, who's going to tell me how to do that? I don't know. And then I had to sit with it and eventually weave it in. And I had so many dreams with him that was confusing. Like there was this ongoing, which we're going to talk about too, the ongoing. And so there were all these pieces that just blew my heart to a place I didn't even quite know how to integrate it all. Eventually and still working through it.
Well, and you really wouldn't want it to come down to, well, there's an easy answer. There are 4 or 5 things you need to know. And this is so global, so comprehensive, so all at once in so many different dimensions. Relearning the world makes a whole lot of sense as opposed to ticking off a little list of tasks.
Well, and I don't want to get into it too much, but I know there's been a response to sort of the diagnostic time frame of grief. And comparatively, I did a beautiful interview with a young photographer from Vancouver. His name is Josh Neufeld, and he lost his father at 28, and he's 35 now. And his father agreed to be in the montage of photographs as he was dying. It was the way his father mentored him in his own death was breathtaking. But he ended up going on a pilgrimage with his ashes later and ended up in Peru. And the Day of the Dead, and they actually closed the whole country down for 2 days, and they all go to the cemetery. To the cemetery. And he just said it was like compared to a diagnostic of like 6 months a year, years later, and he was woven into this, and he said it was so beautiful because the country honored it. They brought food, they played music, they cried together, they told stories, they brought this foreigner in and loved him up. I mean, it was just beautiful. They understood the truth of loving and grieving and living and figuring it all out. And they were doing it as a community. It was quite beautiful to listen, and how he was impacted and helped him in the next steps of his integration and journey, right? It was lovely to listen to him. I'm
sure it did. Part of what I've written about in some places is, it goes back to the web and interconnection. I remember in about 1979 or 1980, had been teaching my course for 5 or 6 years, and I read all these papers and journal entries about their loss experiences. And I said, here's an idea of how in the US and in some other Western countries and so on, we think of people. We think of them as like self-contained little atoms. Just take my hand as the atom, all right? We're completely self-contained. And we've got around us a mom and a dad and some friends and so on. But we're all kind of floating in this open social space. And there's nothing about us that is inherently connected to others. I'm sitting here loving you and you're over here, maybe loving me back, maybe not. But there aren't any threads connecting. It's just, I'm thinking of you in a loving way and you're thinking of me in a loving way. So we kind of associate with one another and get closer to one another. What's it like then when someone dies? No change. Still self-contained. That's not the experience we have when we're bereaved. We don't remain self-contained. Some part of us has been pulled and shredded and so on. Better to think of a web where you're connected in many, many different ways, and you're connected not only to this one person, but others, and you're grounded in your neighborhood and in your work and in the schools you're attending or whatever. And then think of what happens when there's a blow to a web and how the integrity of that web is shaken. And if you have multiple blows, like multiple deaths, like there's a busload of 15 of your friends, or half of your family, or like the Holocaust kind of experience of the Viktor Frankls and others, where perhaps your whole family is obliterated and you're the lucky one who gets to live on with the burden of putting yourself back together, having been shattered the way that web would be shattered. I think the web is the way to go. I remember the first time I presented that at the Association for Death Education and Counseling. And it triggered a bit of a discussion. And it was going pretty well, I thought. But there was this woman who had talked to me before the discussion a little bit, and she asked a question or two, and then she disappeared. And I thought, boy, she got disenchanted. I don't know what's going on here. And finally, the discussion ended after about 20 minutes, and she came back in the room, and she had gone to the little jewelry store in the hotel, and she came back with a little box. And I opened the box, and there was this thing about this big. It was a spider's web with a little spider on the web. She said, I just wanted you to know how much I agree with what you just said about thinking of myself as a web of connections in a far larger web and so on. Every time I've introduced that web metaphor, heads just, yeah, it's not like this. It's like this. And where's the love? I love you. You love me. Where is it? Is it in me? Is it in you? It's between us. It's what's between us that's the reality in this world. It's not what's sort of in isolation. It's the connections we have to everything that make us who we are.
Well,
yeah.
And I have a quote from the Web of Life here. You say, our selves are essentially social and interdependent, and we weave our webs of personal integrity within a web of webs that support and sustain us. We cope as individuals, then against a background of social interaction and within a particular social context. The social context provides historical and personal developmental conditions within which we cope and conditions our progress.
Sure does.
That just so beautifully honors what you're talking about here, because there is this weave of connectedness in all elements of how we interact with life, right?
I think the biologists will tell us that we are inherently social animals, and we ignore that sociality as core of who we are at our peril. And we've got a whole culture. I'm an American by birth and a Canadian by choice, so I'm both. And America is as individualistic a culture as there is on the planet. And there are consequences for that. It's hard to get a valuing of something like a public good. It's hard to get a reasonable self-understanding where meaning in life for many is defined in terms of accumulation as opposed to purpose and meaning. I just read a little thing in the New York Times this morning, and they were talking about educating people for making tough decisions in their lives. And they quoted Thomas Aquinas on 6 or 8 major purposes that you might choose as a purpose for your life. None of them were social in any way. There wasn't an item that said making a difference that lasts, or contributing to something larger than myself, or feeling a part of a movement toward justice or greater compassion in the world. The list didn't include that. Do I like to be entertained? Do I like to accumulate wealth? Do I want reputation? Do I want... And there was all kind of ego values as opposed to deeper, soulful, and spiritual values. And I'm thinking, this is a religious leader who's been revered for centuries and so on. And this is his, and one of them was seeing the face of God. Okay, that's more of what I might expect from such a prominent Catholic thinker and so on. But the rest of them were all very narrowly my own self-interest accumulations. There's too much of that in my home culture, and it's beginning to spill over into the world with what look like disastrous consequences.
Well, so, you know, what's so beautiful in the interviews that I've had the privilege to do with palliative physicians and nurses or people in grief or bereavement, or even exploring near-death experiences or deathbed visions and dreams. So many of the people who are doing this work had a loss, lost a parent, lost a child. I mean, I lost a friend to an incredibly tragic suicide at 18. And that rocked my world and just was unheard of. Like, I don't even tell the details of it because it was a horrific choice of how she took her life. It rippled out. It's over 40 years ago, and she still was around. But then I had amazing dreams with her after, as I was healing, which opened me to this. How in the world did that dream and my connection to her beyond lift the grief and open me to a different journey? So what I've seen in the work that I do and the way people are serving in this avenue being one in a meaningful way is many of their life journeys and serving and looking for deeper meaning and purpose or something greater than themselves came from a profound and impactful loss, either as a child losing a parent and they stepped into it. They didn't go away from it. They stepped into it deeply, even in the work, and then were kind of grew from there profoundly. And it's been moving, including sitting with you, the privilege of listening. And everyone's going to do it differently. That's one thing you do say, that to respect individual grieving styles, because there's no one right way. And sometimes even without in a gender sensitive conversation in this world right now, but sometimes even the male or female, masculine, feminine way of approaching it can be a little bit different. Some need to talk and others go in and are introspective and maybe grieve through activities or creating things, right? It's so individual.
I'm thinking about that. You gave me a little sheet of things to think about. And I think that the early talk about styles in grieving had to do with almost everything had to do with styles in contending with reactions. So you've got sorrow, and there are male and female ways, supposedly, of dealing with sorrow. Some people talk, some people go out and plow a field, or pound a punching bag, or and so on. But I think when you expand beyond focus on grief reaction and its expression to include grieving response as learning how to live in all of its dimensions and so on, I don't think there are male and female ways of learning how to live. I think that no two of us really has the same style in living a life. And if we're going to be helpful at all to anybody who's grieving, we have to listen to their story, and we'll find out about how have they been living and what's not possible now and what might be possible now. And let's talk about that. I've also written, and you've read it by now and so on. I think there's come to be a more mature way of thinking of emotions other than just something that comes at you and pounds on you and you want to make it go away. Physical pains signal to us that there may be something wrong in a leg, in an arm, in a chest, in a heart, and so on. And if it's kind of mild and it goes away, we don't pay much attention. When it persists or when it gets worse, we pay attention. And we say, well, got to get this looked into. And you get x-rays and MRIs and this, that, the chemical tests and so on. And they find out that you've got leukemia or you've got a serious heart problem and so on. The early talk about emotions in bereavement was they have to be expressed in some way or another. I think there's less pressure from emotions to be expressed than there is pressure to be attended to. Just as a persistent pain is saying, pay attention to this. Don't just be annoyed by it. Don't just take a pill to try to make the pain go away. There's something seriously wrong in your body here, or there might be. Pay attention and focus on it and get the help of somebody who knows how to pay attention to it very carefully, because you may be in danger. Well, I think emotions are the same sort of thing. You no doubt tripped across this idea. I wondered once, it looks like the word emotion is something about motion, but what's that E about? And I looked it up. The origin of the term, or one of the origins, is, an original grounded meaning of it is without motion. If you find yourself in the grip of emotion, you pretty much stop. You're held in place. It preoccupies you. It holds you still. And you are just overwhelmed by sadness or overwhelmed by anger or whatever. Anger will move you off the dime fairly quickly. But an awful lot of emotions are signals that there's something you need to pay attention to. If we paid attention to psychological and social pain the way we do to physical pain, we would strive to learn from it. We would give it the attention it's asking for. And you can do it in expressing it, or writing it, or keeping a journal about it, or doing yoga, or analyzing your dreams, and when it's reflected in your dreams, maybe learning from your dreams. All kinds of ways of attending to, in meditation, in spiritual practice, in prayer, in lots of places, you can make it your intention to give this the attention it's crying for. What is it telling me about who I am, who I can be, what might be possible, what I need, some of my deepest needs, and so on. And I've written a little bit about sorrow-friendly practices.
Which is beautiful.
Thinking of sorrows as things from which you can learn.
Right.
I think is very important, as opposed to sitting with one another while experiencing the sorrows. Talking with one another about, it's changing a little bit, or God, it's really intense now, and I'm thinking about this particular experience I had with him or her. And in the talking or expressing or whatever, however you do pay attention to these things rather than running away or trying to mask them with analgesics or alcohol, you can get clues about how you might want to go about relearning, how you might want to live with this thing now that's been troubling you. And I think that's very important. And that's another area where you've got a lot of choices. And I think our culture, unfortunately, is one that where we're kind of trained to get past these things as quickly as we can, as opposed to slow down, take them in, listen to them, learn something important from them. And once you've given them attention, their intensity will probably subside. Especially when
and I do love the way that, I mean, I think we've all felt that sort of human survival instinct, reactionary response, which I've had, at different times from death or other things that have triggered me in my life. But then when you do settle and lean into just feeling it in a different way, feeling it in your heart, in your body, in your being, and you kind of align and try to hold the response in a different way. Sometimes you have to get through the other stuff first. Then there's a wisdom that starts to come out.
Oh, you've got within you, well, I've actually given sermons. All right. And I say, all right, I don't necessarily subscribe to full-blown theologies of one sort or another and so on. But in the spirit that you have within you that isn't broken, you have this capacity to overcome. You have this capacity to grow. You have this capacity to learn and change. In this soul that you have within you, you have a capacity to continue caring and adopt new cares and to continue loving and so on. Your ego isn't broken, but it's kind of defeated, and it's learning lessons about the things that it can't really do.
Exactly.
Your physical body is not broken. Your breath may be kind of halting in some ways and so on, but you're still breathing, and your whole being is really ready to engage. It's been learning how to live its entire life, the whole of you. So an advantage, another one of those good things about grieving is it requires of you that you do what you've always been doing, which is learning how to live.
Right.
Right.
Well, and
it's
but I have to say, one of my material gain and all of that, I think because I've had losses at a younger age, I mean, they help you get along, but it's never my greatest goal in life, because I've watched people whose hearts are open. And my father was like that. He died at 98 a few years ago. People who've kept their heart open to life. So my goal in life has always been to keep my heart open to love, to life, and to the mystery or God or divine, whatever you want to call it, because you can't take all the other stuff with you. And so as I was reading your book, I thought, even during COVID, there were deaths and life turning points that just flattened me again. Like, it was like, whoa, like this never ends, right? But emerging out of that is a deepening, again, awareness of the authenticity of my heart, my deep need to love. I can't imagine not loving, even when loving can be so painful in the vulnerability when you lose someone. I just can't imagine not loving. I just can't. It's just wired in my being to do that, right?
Yes, if you really seriously try to imagine what life would be like if you no longer let yourself care or love, it's pretty cold. Yeah. It's pretty dark. Feeling that there was meaning in such a life, or purpose in such a life, or a reason to live such a life, it would be hard to find it. I'm living so I can breathe.
Right. And you use the metaphor of breath in one of your books so beautifully. And also, and I'm looking at the time, so we are going to kind of have to wrap this a little bit, but another one of your books, which is about the continuing bonds, the heart of grief. And there's so much here, Thomas. I'm going to refer them to the books, but it doesn't end. I mean, there's a relationship. And even with my husband, I had so many dreams and unique kind of serendipitous things that felt like he was touching in. I was overwhelmed, but I thought, I've never experienced like this before. What am I supposed to do with that? You're gone, but you're still around me. Surreal, a gift. And eventually I had to honor that and integrate that too. And there were I just say quickly, just after he died, there were two films that kept coming up on when I watched TV. And one was A Message in a Bottle with Kevin Costner and Robin Wright Penn. It's such a beautiful film because he's just lost his wife and he doesn't want to let her go, but he's trying to open up and the other person's in divorce. And so it shows that in between thing of the loss and honoring and opening and how do you do that. And the other one that was interesting was this old black and white film, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. And I think it was Jean Tierney, a beautiful woman comes to a cottage, and it's an old sailor who had the cottage. He's died, and there's a sailor's clock. And my husband loved the sea and was in the Navy when he was younger, and he had a sailor's clock. Mm-hmm. And she sees his ghost, and they end up falling in love with each other. Mm. And he's not there, he's invisible. And eventually, though, he sees that if he stays connected in a way that's that real to her, she won't be living her life fully. So eventually he sort of puts this veil over their connection. Mm-hmm. She goes forward, and when she dies, they reunite. And I thought, oh my goodness, the gift of those two films.
Mm-hmm. Good for you.
And the metaphor of both, because there was this solid sense of him and many who've died still weaving within my heart and how to integrate. So in your book, The Heart of Grief, you address continuing bonds and the beauty of redefining those relationships even after they're gone, right? It takes a bit of time, but
I've found that continuing bonds interesting, especially the introduction of the book. There were these social scientists, psychologists primarily. We are beginning to discover in our research that some people maintain connections with a person who's died. I've read thousands of journals, and I've met an awful lot of grieving persons. I haven't met a single one who doesn't want to talk about the person who died. If I were a psychiatrist with a history of talking to people on couches about what troubles them and how they're trying to sort out who they want to be and how to get there, I would have noticed that a lot of them have been talking about their relationship with mom or their relationship with dad. Now, isn't that kind of an indication that the relationship with that person is still significant to them, even though mom and dad are long dead? Why would it take a research project toward the end of your career to notice this? Because it's been your business to talk to them about how to disentangle from troubling elements of their relationship with the parent or the like. I was stunned by it. When I wrote my first thing about this personal integrity and the web and so on, in 1980, well before continuing bonds, because of how people had talked to me about and told me their stories, it was clear that there was a wedge with a dead person still part of who they are and what they're concerned about and so on. And I don't know how you could spend a career talking to bereaved people and not have noticed that they still have an ongoing, quite complex relationship with the person who's died. So one of the reasons I wrote The Heart of Grief was to highlight a couple of hundred different ways in which we maintain connections with those who die. And, practical influences. In my first little book at the end, I said, relearning the relationship with the person who's died, there are at least two things that I hope everybody can understand. One, you've got stories of the life of the person who's died that you can tell as long as you live, and that you can return to and learn from and appreciate and value and be grateful for, and so on and so on. And when you come to have a relationship with another person, it could be a partner, it could be a friend, it could be a child, it could be a parent, whatever. You come to share interests with them. Their interests rub off on you. And some of them become your own interests, or some of them are valuable enough anyway that you will go along and enjoy taking the sail or walking through the woods or painting the walls or whatever it is, or going to the baseball games and so on. And interests that have become your own you should be grateful for their becoming your own through the association with this person and so on. You are different because
Exactly.
you have come to have different interests through this relationship. I think of continuing bonds as in part not necessarily something that someone is really very conscious about, but inevitably you're different for having been mothered by your mother as opposed to some other mother. You're different from having been fathered by, grandfathered by, uncled by, aunted by, befriended by people who have died. And those differences are with you. Now, I was talking about earlier, where's the love? I think one of the things we do when we live is we invest our care, our love in things and places and other people and families and communities and so on. And when you die, your love investment is still in that person, in that thing. So one of the things that happens, I remember Michael Carney was in the audience when I was introducing this idea. I was talking about you're walking through the world and you encounter something and it reminds you that the person is not there, okay? And that hurts. And I suggested, reach through the hurt. You are reminded at that place or by that thing or by that conversation of the person. Why are you reminded? Because they've touched that thing. They've touched that place, and you have a sense of that contact that they made. Their love, their care is still there. And if you can reach past the hurt, you'll get reconnected to the person who loved that pathway and who loved seeing the birds along that path. And some of the best in life is yours to be retrieved if you can reach past the initial sorrow of recognizing that they're not physically there.
Right.
This community is different because Dad lived in it. Right. This family is different because Mom was part of it, and so on. And you can see it in your aunts and uncles and your cousins and your friends and so on. They're still there, just not physically present. But the love that they poured into the world is still there. My brother just died in July, and he founded a park in Eugene, Oregon, honoring Nobel Peace Prize winners. He said, we've got too many war monuments. We don't have peace monuments, and so on. My brother is in that park and in that monument. I haven't visited it since he's died, but I'm sure that when I go back there, I'll be with my brother again because his love for that project and for peace and so on is there to be felt. And that's how it is with all of us. There are things that the people we care about have touched and loved, and we can sense it if we allow ourselves to do it. We're surrounded by a world that has been touched by our friends and families. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated. It's simple.
Well, and that person is a weave in the tapestry and heart of our life and our being, right? So that's what you're really highlighting here. So I'm looking at the time, and we do need to, we've gone over, but I've allowed for this because so many people are struggling with grief right now, and in a heightened awareness way. It's always happening in life, but even more so with the pandemic. We didn't have a chance to touch as deeply on children, but I've done a beautiful interview with Dr. Heather Moen, and people can look at that if they want to learn more about including children and honoring children in the experience. But I just want to ask you, it's a signature question I have at the end. How has your heart, or has your heart, been changed by this work?
Oh, that's easy. Given the understanding of the web of connections and how everything is connected, and given serious reflections on living a finite life with death left in. That's what thanatology is. It's a study of life with death left in as part of it. I'm quite confident that I've come to be much more aware of how I'm not a self-made person. I am who I am because of contributions of the universe entire and the people and friends who have been in my life and so on. And I really believe, and with my brother just having died, I think I have felt it. I think the best place to get to in grieving is gratitude. Mm-hmm. And you can dwell in the sorrow and so on. And if you learn how to learn from your sorrow, you can pick up those lessons quickly. Or if you've already learned from a certain kind of sorrow, you can take that lesson with you. I think getting from sorrow to gratitude has become a lot easier for me. Mm-hmm. And people have been writing me notes expressing concern about my sadness, given that my brother's just died, and so on. And the honest truth is I had a kind of a semi-cry, but I watched him die for 3 years. Mm-hmm. And that's where the sorrow was. And I don't need to add any more to that. But in those 3 years, I thought an awful lot about it and even wrote about what my brother meant to me and still means to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm not dwelling in sadness. I'm in a happy place of gratitude. Mm-hmm. I am so fortunate to have had that man in my life for 77 years. It's and I know that I'm different for having had him as a brother. And I told him so. And he told me I wasn't bad too. So
That's beautiful.
And I'm pretty sure that if I hadn't spent my time dwelling as much on grief and loss, I would be having a lot harder time coming to gratitude. And there is just so much to be grateful for. Mm-hmm. Just from the basic of having had a chance to live. Mm-hmm. And then meeting all these people. I mean, one of the things that's part of my life now is, as you age, more and more people you know die. So I thought 2012 was bad when my best friend died and my wife's best friend died and my only sister-in-law died. And then 5 other friends died. And we're up to 7, but we're only in August this year. And there are just clusters in years as the years pile up. And I just instinctively now go to what am I grateful for?
Right.
That's a better place. It's a good place to live.
Right. Well, that's beautiful. And, you know, there's so much here that we could continue talking on, but we really need to just kind of come to a conclusion. It's beautiful that you were able to share the story of your brother to end this conversation and the gratitude of how he's impacted you. But I want to I want people to know about your website and your books. So if you want to learn more about Thomas and his books, How We Grieve, The Heart of Grief, and a beautiful book with lovely photographs, Catching Your Breath in Grief, you can go to his website, griefsheart.com. And I thank you so much, Thomas, for taking the time for this conversation. And I just love your approach to this. It's so intimate and authentic and honors the weave of our connectedness and how each life touches the other. So thank you again today for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity. You're most welcome.